back to my Uncle Herman. When he was found by the other uncle to relate greetings to his mother in Europe, Uncle Herman remembered there was somebody from his brother's in-laws that came to visit him some time ago. He said there was an old lady lived in Brooklyn, not too far from where he lived, and he contacted her. He told her that her nephew was alive and would she do something about it. And I get this letter in Austria, you know, that she's my Aunt Tilly, and she is glad that I have survived, and she would like to help me. It just so happened that both my grandfather and my grandmother on my mother's side both had sisters named Tilly. Both were childless. Okay? One was in America, one was in Europe. The one who was in Europe lived with us the last years while we were still at home. A very mean old person, you know, I can't say anything nice about her, but she was, although she was afforded the greatest respect by my parents. For instance, my mother made her the house, she ran the house. My mother did other things. And, but she and I had a personal dispute going on. Religion was one of them. She was a religious person. She was twice married to Rosh Yeshivas, means heads of religious academies, very much involved in religious politics, you know, a real know-it-all about religious matters. We were not, you know. And we always, as kids, we felt it to be an infringement on our liberties, you know. Every Saturday she would raise hell why we didn't go to synagogue, you know. And, you know, you sit around with your head uncovered, you know, and you're going to end up being an outlaw and what have you. But here I get a letter from Aunt Tilly. I didn't know I had two Aunt Tillys. All I knew, I had an Aunt Tilly, and I know she died. She got killed. So I'm thinking, what's the difference, you know? So Aunt Tilly, let it be Aunt Tilly. Or maybe she's a cousin of the other Aunt Tilly. I don't know, you know. This Aunt Tilly went to work for me. This Aunt Tilly found my mother's brother. This Aunt Tilly had a very, very wealthy sister in Mississippi. Make a long story short, when we got to America, this Aunt Tilly passed the word that that one, meaning me, she's in charge of. The others were, you know, different cousins, you know. They did not have any connection with her, so she took me. She took me in her home, and there I was, you know. Talk about the first night. I'll tell the story about Gyoza too. So the first night went by, and I'm just wondering, I finally got here, and I see this old lady, and she doesn't, I don't remember who anybody was, you know, I really don't, you know. I was not that observant to begin with, and now, you know, a lady says she's my aunt. Which aunt, what aunt, who's, you know, I don't know. In due time, I'll find out. But I said, what happens in the morning, you know, they're going to find out I'm an imposter. Now, where do I go now? You know, I don't even know where the other uncle lives, you know. I had a very, very much a sleepless night. Now a flashback. This Aunt Tilly had a very, very wealthy sister who was the origin of our family being in America. Why? A cousin ended up as a planter in Mississippi. They were small-town people and agriculturally inclined, and he ended up as a planter in Mississippi. And he raised his crops and his family, and then his wife died. And he lived in Drew, Mississippi a long time, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life alone. So he picked himself up and he went back to Europe to find a wife. And he contacted my great-grandfather, who was a very, very distinguished person. I've got his picture over here, but terribly impoverished. he sat in the middle of the town, you know, that was his place of honor and what have you, but impoverished. On top of that, he had 3 daughters to marry off and no dowries to give him, and that's the worst that can happen to any parent. So this American comes in here and talks to the cousin, and he says, I would like to have one of your daughters, you know. But he said, my daughters do not go to America. You know, America was a place of ill repute, okay? Decent people did not go to America. My daddy's people did not go to America. My mother's people did not go to America. Except now there's a chance to marry off a daughter. And having negotiated a long time and realizing that no dowry would be required, he says, which one do you want? And he said, that one. And he picked that one and he took her to America. And she became the known Mrs. Kaplan for many, many years. She was, so to speak, the trophy wife. After many years, he died. She was a great big plantation, not a plantation, a landowner in Mississippi. So she moved to Memphis, established a residence at the penthouse at the Hotel Gyoza, and maintained a chauffeur downstairs, you know, with maid service, you know, lived in style, and played the grande dame, you know. Also, her English was atrocious, you know, but stories about her English too, but that's not what I'm here to tell. She was the cause of most of our people coming to the South or coming to America in the first place. She brought a younger brother from Russia. She brought a bunch of nephews and nieces, including 2 uncles of mine. She brought her brother-in-law, which was my grandfather, who wouldn't tolerate living in the South. There's a lot of families in the Delta to whom we are related, but we don't no longer claim one another. Most Jewish people in the name Kaplan in Memphis, if they are originally from Memphis, are descended from that family. Moskov, Michaels in Clarksdale and Rose, that's not important. This lady lives at the Gyoza Hotel, and she makes a trip to her hometown in the early 30s. And she's interviewing and examining and making wedding arrangements, and this one she will transport to America. She's got a husband for her, you know. You know how old ladies do. And then she picked my mother as being the more down-to-earth person, the one with the most understanding, to be her spokesperson and in Europe. What did that mean? The old lady used to gather up a lot of second-hand clothes, merchandise, anything, pack up big bales, and they would be shipped to our home, where my mother would pick, you know, the express company would deliver them, and then they would open the steel clasps, unpack it, and then my mother would have a great big sorting going on, who gets what, who is deserving, who is not deserving, and then write the end to report of who she got what and get cussed out for doing it wrong. All that's unimportant. Every time I would visit kinfolks, I got to notice that certain of my kinfolks always had things marked Hotel Gyoza. And I finally realized that people on my mother's side were identified by Hotel Gyoza, and if they did not have Hotel Gyoza, then that must be kinfolks on the father's side. Okay, a kid, I've established my identification. And I never realized, I thought it was some kind of family emblem. I don't know, you know. I never dared to ask or particularly cared to know. So now I'm in Brooklyn. It's my first night, and I'm worried about being an imposter. And the train tracks are running overhead, you know, and it's noisy, and the fire engines, you know, and I said, holy smoke, what's going to happen? You know, I don't know. And suppose the Germans come in the morning, which way do I escape, you know? And I wake up in the morning and I look outside the window, and in Brooklyn they hang their laundry on, in the yard, you know, from the second store window. And I look outside the window and I'll be damned, Hotel Gyoza all over the clothesline. So that's my people. But I still don't know what Hotel Gyoza is. So 6 months later, I went to high school, and summer vacation, I was invited to come to visit the family in Memphis. They had a reason for it, so I came to visit, and I'm told that you got to go see the old Aunt Hinda, that was her name, Mrs. Kaplan at the Gyoza Hotel. Okay, and I go up there, and there's this great big hotel with the sign Hotel Gyoza. I said, wait a minute, well, does she own the Gyoza? No, she doesn't own it. Anyway, come to find out, she was a resident of the Gyoza Hotel. And when she was making up the big bales to be shipped to the poor family overseas, she would stuff the towels and the pillowcases from the hotel as extra baggage, you know, and that's how my family became identified in my mind as Hotel Gyoza. That's the Hotel Gyoza story. She happened to be a very, very wealthy lady. A lot of people in Memphis kowtowed to her. She disappointed all of them, and she didn't leave them anything. I think some of them got some of her jewelry, but most of it went down the drain. Picture of hers is on the table. She's not part of our story. Anyway, that's the Hotel Gyoza story. So now I'm with my aunt, who now I realize who she, you know, that I'm at least home. I'm not an imposter, but still, I know she got killed, you know. By and by, over the years, I figured out that there were two Antilles, you know, the other one and this one. As mean and as nasty as the other one was to me, this one was like an angel. Couldn't do enough for me. Looked over me, hovered over me. I was the apple of her eye. But she was a very, very poor person. Extremely so. Her apartment rent was $51 a month, and the pension that her sister established for her was $50. So each month she was $1 short. Okay? I'll give you her economics. And she rented out a room in her apartment to what they called a boarder, and he paid her $16 a month. I remember when I came, she raised him from 15 to 16, you know. That made all the difference in the world, and that was her way of life. She married another man. They pulled resources together, you know. He was just as poor as she was, but outwardly you would never have known. Why? Because she wore her sister's mink coat to church and spoke with that very aristocratic, casual way, you know. She knew how to play it. And her hair was always just spotless, you know. It was one hell of a fine person. She was the family, she held the family together. And as far as I'm concerned, I lived with her 2.5 years. It was 2.5 years of another mother. And I wanted to mention her. Unfortunately, I can't name any of my kids after her because my first wife's name was also Tilly. So I failed in that regard for her. I found other names. I figured it was not going to be appropriate to name my children after her. It's an honor in our custom to name someone after someone that you respect and look up to, like your own parents or what have you. In that regard, I failed her. But with regard to religion, was a very, very religious person. And she used to drop these casual hints about not becoming irreligious. And out of deference to her and other reasons, after I got married, I became religious. Prior to that, it didn't make me any difference. So maybe that answers a question that you wanted to ask, you know. And then you've got to set an example for your other children. You've got to tell them who they are, what they are. If there's any story that needs to be told or anything of the past that needs to be passed on to them, the best way I can do it is through religion, not any other way. Most of us are not talkative. I particularly am not. I mean, today I took time out. I've done it 10 years ago in Hartford, Connecticut, when I sat down and headed a recording session, of which nothing came. But to answer your question, that's why the source of my religious experience is. Now, what other questions do you have?
That's all, unless you want to tell us about your trip that you took just a few years ago.
Okay, the trip we took to, after the war, I was very, very depressed. I did not know what was happening. School would not have me. I didn't know where I was going. A deep, deep state of depression set in. And I did not go back to my hometown. It just so happened that my daddy, being a very practical person and having gone through the practicalities and the experiences of World War I, realized that this is going to be a repeat performance, and he buried a lot of his goods in the ground. Textiles, other things. In one place he buried a lot of gold. Okay. I told my cousin Solomon about it. I says, in case I don't survive and you do, then you should know what is where. And I mentioned certain places to him, and he being probably off the rocker or being careless or whatever, he told the story to a lot of people. And I know that if I go back to this particular place, Dvoritz, I did not want to go to visit graves. I just didn't feel like it. And my uncle Olson was told about that. And he persisted on me going back. And a man, his brother-in-law, came to visit us who was a railroad employee. And conversation got around to it. Oh, he says, no problem. He says, I'll take him to this particular Dvoritz. This train runs this way, and you catch the train that way. And so we got on the train. We came to Dvoritz, and I go to the house where we lived. Remember I told you we lived in 2 rooms. One room on one side of the street and one room on the other side of the street. The side of the street that we were kicked out of, I knock on the door. Survived. The other one was burned down because the labor camp was in it. So I knock on the door of that house, and I asked the lady for a shovel and for permission to go in the backyard, and she says, go ahead, and I start digging, and there's my 55-gallon drum with my daddy's things, and I pull them out, and I go someplace else in the yard. I knew exactly what to do, and this lady is baffled. I cover up the hole, and I thank her very much, and I go away. I go across the street, and this is the funny part. Across the street where the house burned down, my daddy buried gold in the basement, and I was there when he did it. On purpose, I suppose. So I go across the street, and I take the same shovel, and I start shoveling the snow out of the basement. The house is burned, so now it's an open basement. And I'm digging. And a neighbor comes up, and he said, introduces himself. Yeah, he remembers me, my mother, could he help me? I said, please. And he takes his shovel, and he helps me dig the snow. And we dig up the snow, and I go to the spot where I knew the stuff was, and he says, what are you digging? And I told him, I said, there's something in here that I need to find. He says, are you looking for Winestone's gold? I said, how do you know about Winestone's gold? He says, every surviving Jew from that town that came to visit went to that basement to dig for Winestone's gold. My cousin told everybody, the word spread out. So he says, you're wasting your time. They've already probably found it. So I'm already here. I might as well keep digging. So I dig, And it was not down, it was under the foundation, you know, in a certain way. And I miscalculated. It was supposed to have been 2 feet underground. It was 2.5 feet, you know, maybe it sunk. I don't know. But I found it. When my shovel hit the can, I pulled it out. The wrapping that the can was in rotted away. I opened it up, and there it was, and now I'm a millionaire, literally. And I'm taking out, you know, the first gold piece, and I tip him, you know. And he says to me, son, he says, with all that's happened to you today in this town, you're going to be dead by nightfall. You know, if you're not going to be robbed, people will kill you out of jealousy. If the police comes, they will certainly confiscate it and kill you. The best thing you can do is get away. And I think that's good advice, and we get away. And I go back to my uncle's hometown, literally a millionaire, you know. Not only do we now have clothes, and we, you know, made clothes, you know, with jackets and pants and all kinds of things. But, you know, I got a jar full of gold, too. A man shows up from my hometown by the name of Koza. Koza means goat. He comes to visit me, and he says, we got to talk. And pleasantries go, you know, we go through the pleasantries, and he says, you know, so-and-so survived, and so-and-so survived. He said, we got to build a monument in that hometown. I says, true, you know, I thought about it quite often. I said, why don't you and I get together, and we'll contact everybody, and we'll, he said, oh, no. He said, you are going to do it by yourself. So I said to him, why me? He said, because you found Winstone's gold, you know. I said, how do you know about Winstone's gold? And he says, Stepan told him, you know. So he's got the facts all right. And I figured this way, if I admit that this is going to be an act of blackmail forever, you know, today it's the monument, tomorrow he wants to take his girlfriend to the beach, you know, it's a forever thing. If I don't admit, you know, then who's going to build a monument? If I don't admit, he'll probably call me a liar and report me to the Russian secret police, because the possession of gold is against the law. And I am just in a terrible state. A little boy in that town, also a survivor, and wasn't quite friendly with him, but you know, how many of us were there? Probably less than a half a dozen. He walks in the house and he says, Teddy, you're white as a sheet. I said, that's right. He says, you got problems with your visitor. He's younger than me. I was 15 at the time, 14. He's probably 2 years younger than me. He says, you got a visitor who's giving you trouble. And I said, that's right. He says, you would like to get rid of him, wouldn't you? I said, oh, if I never saw him, it would have been the best thing in my life, you know. He said, no problem. He walks outside. About 30 minutes later, he comes back with a rifle. Apparently, as the armies moved back and forth, he got a hold of a rifle, and by that time we were already educated that you had to have a piece of something, you know, to protect yourself with. And he buried it in his barn. And he, you know, uncovers his rifle, cleans it up, and he walks into the house and he says, Uncle, to this old man, he says, Uncle, you are going to the railroad station. Now, Uncle said, you know, he's not an uncle, but that's the way you address him. And he says who? And he says me and my 30, the Springfield rifle, whatever they called him. And he cocks in, he, you know, jams the bullet in the chamber, and he says, now, points it at him, put your coat on. And he puts on his coat, and he says to him, now let's have it understood. He says, I don't know why you're here. And this is a nice little bitty kid. He says, I don't know why you're here, and I don't want to know. But he said, apparently you and my friend Teddy have a problem. He says, so if something ever happens to Teddy, you are responsible. Makes no difference what, when, or where. For the rest of your life. Anything happens to Teddy, he says, you're responsible. I will come and kill you. And if I won't kill you, he says, you see this boy across the street? He will come and get you. And down there's another boy, you know, we're all part of the same clique. They didn't exist, but he will come and get you. He marches him 13 kilometers to the railroad station, puts him on a train, and Mr. Gyoza disappears out of my life. Okay? I have not seen Gyoza since, but I have never built a monument. And I had mental problems because of that. And after the war, the Russian state disintegrated. Some of my other friends whom I've known have made a trip like that. I decided to go, and I went. And it was very disappointing. The old structures don't really mean anything. Most of the old structures were gone. You know, the church was still there, but the church doesn't mean anything to me. The place where we lived, one of them was dilapidated and rebuilt, and it doesn't look alike the same way. The old place where we lived during the labor camp burned down, was not rebuilt. It's just a pile of rubbish. And I had trouble finding the place, getting myself oriented. You know, I thought it was 7 houses further down. And then I knock on the door, and I asked the lady, you know, did you always live here? And she says, this has always been princely, whatever their caste property. You never had any. She says, who are you? And I tell her. She got me mixed up, an old lady. She got me mixed up with my daddy. And she says, you want that house? You know, now I'm beginning to figure out who, what, and when. And I'm picking the house that I think is where our house used to be, and I knock on the door. And I knock on the door, and the lady answers, and I says, did you always live here? She says, no. She says, who are you? And I tell her. She said, I don't know who you are. I said, who lived in this house before you did? She says, well, there was another house, and it disappeared, and the people's name was Mizell. And I'd forgotten about that name, but when she said Mizell, it rang a bell. I said, that's the place. Described Mizell to me. She described her, you know. She describes her. She was a seamstress, you know. So who lived across the street? She describes the people across the street with the, you know, the neighborly jealousies, you know. They were both seamstresses. I hear the whole story. You know, and now I know I've got the right person, and we're discussing old times. And I said to her, can I look in the back of your yard? She said, no. I said, what have you got in the back of your yard? She said, why do you want to look in the back of your yard? I said, you know, I used to live here at one time. She says, you know, she's very nice. She said, a funny thing happened. About 50 years ago, a boy came to my door, asks me for a shovel and for permission to dig in the back of my yard. And I give it to him. He goes right to the back of my yard. He starts digging and digs up all these good things, you know. He doesn't say thank you. He doesn't do anything, and he goes away. And I'm translating all this to my wife, because my wife and my son were with me. And she says, she's telling you your story. She said, then we talk about it, you know, how the boy did her wrong, you know. I wasn't courteous, you know. She said, I'll tell you what. She says, if you are go in the backyard and look. If you're going to do any digging, we got to have an understanding. It's 50-50. That's the story of the main part of my trip. We went out to see the grave. I didn't know it, but apparently there were 2 graves, not one, on each side of that particular road. It's 2.5 miles from town in a ravine. We found one of them. There was a marker put up by the local government or the local township or whatever. It says nothing about a date, who, what, when, anything. It just has 4 or 5 Russian words. Basically, it says victims of Nazi aggression. And that's no date, not the fact that it is a mass grave. It was a little fenced off, but the fence is already dilapidated. The marker still stands. Across the road, I looked for the other grave, and I never did find it. People in the vicinity that I asked were never even heard of it. so you had to find somebody who was way up in age to remember it. Go ahead. Okay, my trip to Belarus, that was my main part was traveling to my hometown. We visited other places of my childhood which are of no significance to anyone other than me, you know, where we used to go for the summer home, where we did travel, the railroad stations that I always played with. All of that is of no importance. My hometown, where I was born and raised, was burned by the Germans when they retreated. It's now, the streets have been renamed. It took me 6 hours. The town has been rebuilt on the same, in the same diagram, a little different. But when the car drops you off at a corner and he says, "This is your hometown," I said, "I don't know which way to go. Nothing is familiar." I mean, not one thing. In fact, there used to be a statue on one side of the street. It was moved on the other side of the street, so that really confuses you. And it took me 6 hours to find out where I was. After I figured out where I was, I started locating things. Everything is little. The neighborhood that we lived in is now a slum. Maybe it's a nice neighborhood now, but to us it looks a slum. There used to be a long 3-block walk from our house to school. It's just like around the corner now, you know. And my God, I mean, how could they have squeezed all these things in? You know, there was a sawmill in between, and then there was this one's house and that one's store, you know, and then there was a ditch. Nothing, you know. It's all disappeared. The football field behind our house, truly a slum. You know, scary as all hell. The nicer part of town, the hotel, all of those are not important things. I was only able to find all that because the way the street is paved. The street is paved with asphalt tiles. And when I saw an asphalt tile street, I jumped out of my car and I asked people, are all the streets in this town paved that way? Why? That was the only street in our town that was ever paved, and it was paved in a polished manner, the old 19th century way. So that's how I finally got myself oriented. I found my uncle's house, the rich uncle's house, which burned but was since rebuilt. And I wanted her to have the pictures of it, but she didn't. As I was beginning to get oriented, I told my son, I said, "You go see if that building has a rounded vestibule." You know, in the French manner. Sure enough, it had it, and then we asked for permission to walk in. It is now an office building. I said, "John, you walk in, and you'll see a great big hallway." He says, "Daddy, it's not a big hallway. It's just a hallway." I said, "Are there 4 rooms on the right and 3 rooms on the left?" He says, "That's true." And I said, "Now you go at the end of the hallway and you'll find a communication center." My uncle was a very, you know, in those days, they had inside plumbing. You know, people used to be a showcase. People would come to look at how the inside plumbing works. And on top of that, he had a communication center. So in case somebody in the house needed the help, needed the nanny or needed they were very well staffed. So you rang the bell. The first ring was the room number that you were in. Each room was assigned a number. And then the second bell was who it was that you were calling. So John goes back, and sure enough, he says, there is no communication center, but there's a great big hole in the wall. In other words, what equipment there was has been removed. Memory was great. I remembered a lot of detail, unimportant detail. You know, the churches, you know, I need to tell you, did I tell you the story about the eye? Yeah, okay. My hometown was a disappointment to me. No one knew anything. I went to look for the Jewish cemetery. Nobody in town knew where it was. Finally, we located some, and it was not the Jewish cemetery. There were a few Jewish people lived in the town after the war, and when they died, that's where they were buried. I finally figured it out because it was just a few graves, and the markers were dated 1960, 1970, so I figured it out. That's not what I was looking for. The mass graves had a big Jewish population where I suppose most of my friends would be buried, gone. Nobody knew where. Russians are very, they're cold-blooded about it, you know. That's a sentiment that bears no paying attention to. But some people from Israel came and they bought a plot of ground in the city, and they fenced it off, and they put up a marker on it, and it says, "This is in memory of." In fact, it says in English too. And but it also tells you that this is not the burial place. You know, don't. It's just a marker, and it's fenced off. Had to climb the fence because nobody knew who had the key to get in. It's a forgotten issue. Then I went to visit my Uncle Benny's hometown. Everything in there has disappeared. You could tell, I could tell by the street paving where the mall used to be. They had a mall, and it's still empty space, but there's nothing on it. It's overgrown. I went to see the Bliss Farm, which was outside my grandmother's home, which was, at one time I thought it was truly a palace. It wasn't. There was some little old house sitting on top of it, and the lady asked me, I asked her for permission to go in. She says, "What do you want?" She says, "You come to reclaim your property?" I said, "No, I don't want anything, you know. She said, "There ain't no need for you to go in here, you know." Police were sitting parked right outside, and I asked them. They said that she doesn't want you to see it, and there's nothing you can do about it. And we spent a couple of hours there. There was one gentleman who showed me a few things that I wanted to see, and I tipped him, and that was the end of it. Naturally, to do it again, I see no purpose in it. I've discussed the question of the marker with somebody, some rabbinical sources. None of them would give me a straight answer, which they never do, as to whether I should go back and put up a monument or not. They said the best monument you can put up is among the living. The dead are dead. And, basically that's the answer that I've gotten. Marker is there, whether that's my parents' grave or not, I don't know. Remember, they told me that there were two. I was always under the impression that it was on the left side of the road. The marker that we found was on the right side of the road. But there's no one you can talk to. There's no mayor or no city government, nothing. It's lawless country. A lot of people in town just sitting around doing nothing. Asked them if some old lady said she remembered my mother, but maybe she did, maybe she didn't, who knows. To go back again, I don't recommend it. Was I glad I made the trip? Yes. And I'm glad I took at least one of my kids with me. It was a tough trip. Minsk, which is the capital of that republic, is a well-organized city. My hometown is not my hometown anymore. It has 34 bus lines running. I could tell by the number of the buses. In all directions, the sections with high rises. that's not my hometown anymore. You know, I know the ground that may be of some meaning to me, but I'm glad I took my boy with me. I don't know how much he got out of it, because I made another mistake that most traveling people like this do. I started exercising my knowledge of Russian, you know, which I haven't spoken in 50 years. And suddenly I'm attempting to speak, and instead of speaking to him and telling him things, you know, I spent most of my time talking to my driver. The service was very good. Facilities, poor. The hotel in Minsk they had an Olympic contest at one time, so they built fancy hotels. The hotel is still there and it's still fancy, and a slew of German and Korean, Japanese salesmen trying to drum up business. You've never seen anything like it. The main highway, which runs through my hometown, jam-packed with trucks going from Germany to Moscow. So that's the main route. But the countryside is dead. I mean, the drunks are on the walking, you know, straggling on the road. You know, there's a woman sitting on by the highway shepherding 12 geese. You know, that's her job, you know. There's another man, an old man, you know, shepherding the you know, a herd of cows. Herd of cows is probably a dozen, 2 dozen at the most. Beautiful country. How we ever ended up there is a miracle, and how we got out, how I got out of there is a miracle. What can I tell you? I was glad to get out of there. We carried our own food. This part of the world is not too far from Chernobyl, and so we carried our own food and our own water. So we never did know what they had to offer in the way of eating facilities. The last day, though, I went into the cafeteria and I saw what other people ate, and it was plentiful. I mean, a lot of ham, a lot of kielbasa. You know, they treated the visitors royally. We sat down to eat, and we didn't eat, but we ordered anyway. And then when the check came, it was $1.12. And I gave him $3, and the man just almost literally kissed my feet. It's a very, very backward place. We were glad to get out of there. It's not a place to go to. How, you know, the Jewish experience in that part of the world, it was supposed to have been the culture center of Jewish learning, but it's all gone. I mean, nothing is left of it naturally, and the population doesn't know it. I think in Minsk I saw a sign, and my reading ability of Russian is not all that great either. I know how to read, but that doesn't mean I understand what I read, everything. And the best I could figure out that they were advertising a museum about life in the Minsk ghetto. If that's what it was, you know, then at least I admire them for that. But other than that, it's a dream, it's a memory, it's a bad memory. It's gone, finished, forgotten. We got to look to the future only. The past is gone. And that is my interview.